All right, hello everybody. I'm Levi Pingleton, and today at Truthworthy, I've got a really awesome guest that I'm very excited to get to meet and get to share with you guys. I've got Pat Flynn from the YouTube channel Philosophy for the People, and he's here today to let us ask him some questions and learn a little bit about him. And we're just going to dive right into it, man. Pat, if you want to go ahead and just give a quick introduction. And also, I wanted to point out that Pat has written a book called The Best Argument for God. And he just has recently published this and got it out. And I've heard a lot of awesome news about it, but I wanted to go ahead and let you kind of give a little promo on it.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Levi and David. It's
All
good
right.
to be here. Yeah, the book's called The Best Argument for God. It was just published back in October. Here it is.
Yeah, beautiful.
Yeah, I was really happy with the production that Sophia put into this. So we can talk about that later if we want. I've been I guess I've been doing the philosophy thing for a very long time. I mean, I was interested in philosophy before I even knew what philosophy was. And then you get older and you realize, oh, these types of questions, those are philosophical questions. That sounds cool. I'll do that. So that's sort of my short story. I was really a naturalist, a philosophical atheist for many years. And really that was the product of having an early encounter with the so-called conflict thesis between religion and science and stuff like that, but also being influenced. A lot of my early philosophical influences were those old atheists and existentialist thinkers. I've told this story so many times before, so if I omit any important details, you can pull them out of me later. But just to condense it for now, the deeper I sort of went into philosophical naturalism, the more problems I thought I was encountering and that I saw. So I began to really just sort of question the entire paradigm. Wanted to take another look at some of those really great classical thinkers that I had a passing familiarity with in my sort of undergrad years. The great pagans. Really sort of became deeply fascinated by them, realized there was more to them than was initially impressed upon me. Somehow or other, I don't quite remember how, I came upon St. Thomas Aquinas and really the entire school of Thomism, all those thinkers who followed in sort of the philosophical footprints of Aquinas. And it was there I really felt like I was finally starting to find a systematic philosophy that could answer the biggest, most pressing questions in life. It could give me a worldview, a sort of philosophical big picture of everything to answer, those big ticket questions, like why is there anything at all? How do we explain an objective moral dimension? How do we make sense of human consciousness or, personal identity through time? All those deep puzzles I felt that Thomism actually had not just good answers to, but systematically coherent answers where the whole system sort of hung together. So it was deeply attractive to me. Of course, you can't spend a whole lot of time in Thomism just philosophically without also getting heavy doses of theology that sort of opened me up and got me interested into Christianity. And once I began investigating that and saw that there was, quite a strong case, I felt historically that could be made for the core claims of Christianity and really the Catholic Church as well. Add in all the other elements of the human person that go into a conversion, the emotional and the spiritual, those are all there too. And then, here I am now, a Catholic who does mostly really all philosophy. Sometimes people ask me theology questions. Please don't. I'm not a theologian. I'm really just a philosopher. And that's
so
it.
interesting, man, Pat, because as you came through and kind of went from having that naturalist, perspective, and then grew into, a more theological and sound classic, sounds more scholastic, philosophical kind of point of view that you grew into, that it's just such an interesting journey that you had personally, because someone like myself, I was raised a Christian, and I always kind of had these, things within, arm's reach to be able to look into. And I kind of started looking more into philosophy and even kind of getting interested in it through apologetics and looking through Peter Kreft's work he's got that handbook for Christian apologetics, and that whole book was basically a lot of philosophical concepts. And as I kind of, learned to become a better apologist, I realized that I just really wasn't a great philosopher, and that I really needed to learn the more foundational and fundamental principles of good philosophy so that I could apply the logic and reasoning that comes into making those sound arguments for the Catholic faith, which now, I'm recently just converted to becoming Catholic, and now to be able to use those tools, I'm trying to learn better philosophy. And through your channel and through a lot of other resources that I've gone to, I've been able to start piecing together what you were talking about in the beginning, as you were responding to my first question, that, getting that system together and being able to really piece together your ideas and your views of reality and being able to make sense of them in a systematic and logical way that is presentable to share with others, that maybe aren't familiar with philosophical terms or the more scientific terminology that we use, but that we can, water it down and give it a common sense, sense to it, so that people like me, as I came up, I know I'm not a big brainiac. I needed simple learning tools in order to figure out these deeper philosophical concepts.
Yeah,
So,
a lot of good points there, Levi. I'll just jam on them for a few
yes.
minutes here. So I was sort of the opposite, right? I was doing a lot of, I guess, philosophical work, and some people found it apologetically useful. So I was kind of brought into, different, I guess, apologetic circles, if you will. But I really just concentrate on what I do, I think, best, which is what I'm most interested in, which even more specifically is natural theology. And for people who aren't familiar, natural theology is really, it's the science of God, but with just sort of unaided human reason. The natural theologian is the person who, from the armchair, tries to discern questions about fundamental reality. Is there a fundamental reality? What is its nature? All that sort of stuff, apart from any sort of divine revelation. So it's like, what can the philosopher know about God, if anything? That's natural theology. And that always interested me the most, because it's sort of a part of philosophy of religion, which is itself a sort of unfortunate label for, I think, the most interesting branch of philosophy, because philosophy of religion isn't a bunch of religious people doing philosophy. Philosophy of religion is really philosophers who are in the business of worldview construction or discovery. There's many atheist and agnostic philosophers of religion, and it's the sort of philosophers that are really trying to build a big picture theory of reality. So fairly early on, I realized, these questions that haunt me, the most important questions of life, I teased a few of them out earlier. If there's like any sort of area where these questions are seriously dealt with and maybe even answered, it's over there. It's in philosophy of religion and natural theology. So that's always sort of seized my attention, and that's useful in some apologetic circumstances, specifically like arguments for the existence of God and stuff like that. I stay out of most of the other apologetic debate. It's just not my specialty and stuff like
Just
that.
not your thing.
I've thought about them very hard. They're important questions to me, but division of labor type of thing. Something else you said that I wanted to hit on, but now it's completely escaped my mind. So I'll just turn it back to you guys.
Well, I'm kind of glad it did skip your mind for a second, because I kind of wanted to stop you right there for a minute. You were talking about developing that worldview and really developing the big picture of reality. And that's a big concept that I want to present to my audience here at TruthWorthy, is giving them resources and tools to be able to do that themselves. And I think that that's such an important concept that a lot of catechetical teaching and a lot of just teaching in general within the church is lacking, because now today, with our relativistic culture that we live in, where kind of anything goes and your truth is your truth and my truth is my truth kind of thing goes on really frequently. I've realized that a lot of people have no objective view of reality in any kind of a sense, and that even a lot of lay people within our church and in the Catholic Church don't really have a good understanding of what objective reality and what objective truth really is. And with you focusing on your apologetics skill being more towards the natural theology realm and outside of the revelation, it kind of helps to build that understanding that, you know, there are things that are in reality that are real, that exist, that are objectively true, and that we really can, you know, scientifically give evidence for and try to explain and understand within our existence in this actual reality that we do truly live in. And if we can develop some you know, simple ways to delve into those areas for people, I think that it would teach them a whole lot more solid foundation for them to be able to peer into philosophical concepts without that skepticism that a lot of people have naturally from living in a relativistic life, you know, culture.
Yeah, relativism is, well, sometimes we hear that we live in a very relativistic culture. It's true and it's not, right? I mean, there's sort of a superficial relativism, but once you really sort of press people, you realize they're not really
They're
relativists
not really
that
relativist,
that
right?
much at all, right? So, yeah, what's going on here? Well, there's different sort of brands or flavors of relativism. On the sort of softer side, you might have a moral relativism, that whatever else morality is, it's sort of relative to personal opinion or cultural
And that's
conditioning
a big one
or
right
whatever,
now.
right? Yeah. But there's more aggressive forms of relativism, right? That go beyond the moral dimension. They might like sort of a global relativism that even all truth is relative or something like that.
Yes.
And that's I guess that's less endorsed by serious philosophers because it tends to suffer from these issues of self-defeat or self-refutation, right? Like, is that claim objectively true type of deal? Well, if so, then there's at least one objective truth, so it's not all relative. I'm sure you guys have heard all
Well,
those
and
lines
it
before.
seems like that's something I run into a lot, man, is that you know, people from a more atheistic worldview or just straight up from a relative, they say relativistic worldview, but it's not, like you said. But when they come at you, it's like anything that you try to give them an answer for, it's like they have a way around it, a way to you know, just blow off the argument as if it's no argument at all. And there's no area for it's like, where, how do you even begin to have conversation with people like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Let me circle back to that because I want to just
Yes,
kind of
sorry.
close the loop on the relativism thing, right? So yeah, the global relativism I don't think is a serious intellectual, adversary. And like I said, there's very, very few philosophers, theist or atheist, who really endorse that strong of a thesis. Moral relativism is I guess a bit more prominent. Most ethicists, again, theists or atheists, are not moral relativists. They're moral realists. So it seems to be kind of more of a thing that you encounter on the popular level than the professional level, but it's still there.
Yeah.
But again, what you find on the popular level, it's sort of this superficial thing, right? You'll have people who say, "Hey, you shouldn't really just impose your values on other people."
Yeah.
Because, just because this was the values of your culture doesn't mean it's the values of their culture. But they're using normative language, right? You should not, you ought not, right? So is that a universally binding moral imperative? If so, then you're not really a relativist, right? We just might
Right.
just disagree about what the moral norms are. So that's sort of, again, where you're exposing the superficiality and you kind of show that, no, you really are committed to this sort of objective, moral dimension or normative web or whatever, but we disagree on the moral facts, if you will, but you do
Yes.
hold to moral facts, right? As in sort of mind independent, objective, and universally binding things. That's a lot of people, but you will
Yeah.
find more sophisticated, moral relativists out there, or subjectivists, or non-cognitivists, or straight up, nihilists and stuff like that. And those are different, more unique cases. And in situations like that, where somebody is really denying objective moral reality, there I think it's more of again a worldview comparison type of thing.
Yeah.
Like, okay, why do you hold this view of morality? Well, maybe they are a materialist, an atheist, a nominalist, and it's those sort of uh principles that are more downstream or upstream, depending how you're thinking about it, right? I guess upstream, that are leading to that conclusion. Now, why would that be? Well, if you're sort of a hardball physicalist reductivist or whatever, and you think that everything is explained through some combination of atomic and evolutionary theory, probably the best and leanest story you can tell about morality is that it's something that was sort of programmed in us through evolutionary forces that was useful for having sex and avoiding bears. And there's nothing more to the story than that. Okay, that fits well within your framework. That is nihilistic. But where I should be having the conversation isn't arguments for objective morality. Where I should have the conversation is why I think that entire world picture is wrong. Not just that it clashes with our deep moral intuitions, which I think that it does, and I think most people would say, yeah, that nihilism just seems wrong. Okay, but maybe our seemings are wrong, right? Rather, what I would do is say, here's a different world picture, classical theism, that does not have those nihilistic outcomes, that can very well situate a moral story that can ground objective moral truths and values and obligations and normativity and teleology and all of that. It's compatible with all of science and evolutionary theory, and it fits our intuitions and seemings really well. And I think it's a better theory for explaining many other things aside. So we don't have to give up, the great moral picture. We might be committed to some moral truths once we get into ethical theory that might make you uncomfortable in our current secular society. It's a different story, right? But that's how I would begin to sort of facilitate that sort of conversation. And this relates to what you're talking about, Levi. How do you engage people? It depends on the person.
Yes, you just touched on that very well.
But the thing is, a lot of people are having debates like way downstream, and they don't realize how the problem is actually a lot more fundamental, right? Like you need to rewind the philosophical tape so far back to really get to the core of your disagreement, that if you don't do that, you're focusing, on I don't know, the moral debate or whatever, when it's really,
and it's not
much more fundamental. It's not going to be that fruitful, I don't think. So yeah, maybe that gives you something to we can jam on that a little bit more.
Yeah, man, because I've realized you just really hit on a lot of important topics as far as for especially hitting on people like me and David, my co-host, and other people that we interact with on social media, because we do a lot of apologetics work on like Facebook, and in that community, you see a lot of people taking different, approaches to apologetics. And I think what you said really hit home, and exactly is why I have found that I want to teach philosophical principles on my channel and learn more about philosophy in general, because you're right. A lot of the areas that these debates are going into are really just way too far upstream, and it goes the stream backwards down to the philosophy that actually builds the system around the views that are being represented is more so I think a fruitful thing for people to learn right now, because they can turn those arguments into a much more sound and logical presentation, so that you can do exactly what you were saying, present a worldview and have that conversation like you were suggesting, where you do the worldview comparison and you just kind of break it down from there.
Yeah, I think that's good. And when it depends who you're talking to, and how much they've even thought through these questions themselves. But I think that's right. I think getting down to the fundamentals.
Is that kind of how you got approached? Is that kind of how, like, what were your first interactions with Christianity like, and how did you start kind of delving into becoming what you are now?
I mean, very isolated. I had zero Christian friends. Honestly, I had like zero. I had one. I know that's not true. I had one religious.
And I asked that because I'm exactly the same, man. I mean, I grew up as a Christian, going to church on Sunday and, culturally Christian and all that. But dude, none of my friends were Christian. I had a very secular worldview until I was in my, mid-20s.
Yeah. No, same here, man. All my friends were completely secular. A lot of them, very smart people. We'd have good, deep. In fact, the most religious friend that I had was Hindu. Still a great friend of mine, and so there's a lot of worldview similarities as a classical theist, monotheist, all that sort of stuff. But that's it. All my other friends were atheists or completely religiously indifferent, just didn't care, didn't think about it. So my journey, my spiritual journey, not just the intellectual, was very isolated. I didn't really have any Christian or Catholic friends to talk to until I really decided to like get involved in the church. And then of course, then you put yourself in that environment, and you start meeting people, and it changes.
So did you kind of look up, did you do your research and things kind of through your own self-education?
Well, I mean, in terms of philosophy, I'm formally trained. I don't have a PhD, but I have my master's.
Right.
But in terms
from
of,
I'm talking more like in Catholicism and kind of breaking through and becoming Catholic. Did you do that through your own self-education and research?
yeah. So, man, taking me back. Let me think here. So for the Catholic Christian thing, I'll give you guys the quick biography, and then we can pull out any questions we want. So, philosophically, let's set the framework here. Classical theism, which Catholics are dogmatically committed to,
Yes.
I think serves as something of a probability pump, if I could put it that way, for the Christian story, for something like the incarnation and atonement. Once you unpack all the kind of commitments of classical theism, of God is purely actual and perfectly good, and the diffusiveness of the good, and the reason that God creates, and the hierarchy of being, all these things. I talk a lot about them in the book, right? And then the fact that the world has just gone absolutely screwy from obviously, basic experience. Something like the incarnation and atonement begins to just be very fitting. This is something I liked about Aquinas and the scholastics. They had a lot of fittingness type of arguments. They weren't meant to be historical proofs. They just didn't have that at the day, right? But they had these fittingness, these fittingness arguments, right? When you think about God's intention to, bring creation into union with himself, and what the nature of the incarnation is, and how God is redeeming us. I mean, the Christian story just fits really, really well, right? Yeah. So it just stood out to me strongly within a philosophical backdrop in a way that none of the other religious options did. And I had previously spent, as I was, seriously opening up to the reality of God and the possibility of religion, I guess, like most Americans, you sort of look east at first, right? I mean, I was really looking I had this Hindu friend of mine. He's a super smart guy, really looking at the different schools and traditions of Buddhism. But yeah, just not really finding the deep, systematic, sort of, philosophically rich answers.
Like all your answers weren't quite getting answered.
Yeah, I was really looking.
It wasn't all kind of fitting together.
Right. So, but then again, once you're kind of in Thomism, you start to see this wonderful extension from reason, with faith, right? And that's something that the church has always articulated, right? That faith isn't below reason; it's above it, right? It extends beyond it. And certainly what you find within Catholicism, and I guess my approach here is a little bit different, because I'm not going to try and give a historical proof. I think a very strong historical case can be made for the core claims of the Catholic Church, the papacy, and the resurrection, all that, right? But for me, as a philosopher, man, it's the coherence. And when you look at Catholic theology, there is like, at a glance, you might think, wow, this looks like an absolutely jumbled mess of commitments. But when you really look at it and study it, you actually realize that this is a deeply interrelated web of mutually reinforcing and mutually informing, deeply theological commitments, right? Of what Mary, as the Ark of the New Covenant, says about the person of Christ, for example, right? And you realize these commitments, and that's just one of countless examples, right, of what might seem arbitrary on the surface is actually deeply, profoundly penetrating and profound, right? And once I saw this sort of web of coherence, it exploded certain misconceptions that I had about the Catholic faith, and really the Catholic faith, right? And I saw this just pure intellectual muscle behind the Catholic tradition, and not just the theology, but it seemed to me that the Catholic Church was getting a lot of, philosophy right, philosophy of God right, natural law, metaphysical commitments, ethical commitments. Like, it was just scoring a lot of points, right?
Yeah, man.
So like all this to me is just making it like really, really interesting. There were some things, of course, that I wasn't sure on, and there are countless things that I could never go and just confirm, right? I think this is a mistake of people who maybe are thinking about converting to Catholicism from atheism or Protestant. They look at all the commitments, all the dogmas, like, man, I got to check off each of the, make sure each one of these is true. But that's totally the wrong way to, you're never going to be able to do that for any worldview or any commitment, right? Ever. You gotta get to the core claim, and that is, can I trust the authority of the church, right? Is there good reason to believe that, right? And then if you have that as kind of your core commitment, then the rest are just consequences, right? The assumption or whatever, those are consequences of the core commitment that you already, and if you don't have any reason to disbelieve it, you have good reason to take that core commitment, then you're good to go. Maybe you have, confirmed or checked off a few things here and there, which for me were the big philosophy ones, like the philosophy of God and how the church teaches, classical theism, which for me was, the big one, right? This is the area I spent the most time on thinking about the existence and nature of God, and like aligned up extremely strongly with the church dogmatically commits people to. I know that triggers a lot of people, that the church has these strong dogmatic commitments to a certain conception of God, but I think that's right. I think that's right, right? And ethically, and the consistency. So yeah, I want to just emphasize that, like, man, before, like, if you think conversion means like I gotta like bring out Ott's book of dogmatic theology and like check each one of these, and sort of like, you're never going to make it, dude. You're never going to make it. You got to get to the core commitments and claims, which of course there's the core commitments of God's existence or that, but it's really a question of authority. Authority. And the other thing for me, I know I'm just throwing a lot out there, was the fittingness of the Catholic Church. We're human beings. We're rational social animals that require tradition, hierarchy, authority. Sometimes these are terms that trigger people in our modern, very atomistic, individualistic age. But look, we live in an age that is very contrary to human nature in a lot of ways. And I think that's a mistake, right? But when you understand human nature, also the idea that God works with things according to their nature, this is a great scholastic principle, right?
Yes.
Again, how that revelation is sort of, passed down, passed along, communicated, how we participate in, the life of the church physically through the sacraments, because we're physical beings. So what am I saying here? There's a lot of reasons I became Catholic, and these are just some of them, and they all just fit so well within this greater sort of metaphysical, philosophical worldview that I felt was correct, right? This grand theme of participation, if you follow Thomas Aquinas, right? It all fits, it all hangs together so extremely well. So sorry, that's a lot there. I don't know if any of it made sense, but you get what you pay for when you bring me on your show.
I think people will be rewinding that and listening to that over and over again, because you gave a whole lot of, like I said, apologetics tools without even trying to us, especially when you were touching on presenting, the church's authority, and the historical case for the church. Yeah, sure, we could make it, but that we need to convince people, why do we have a church that's authoritative, and teach those sound, reasonable concepts. Common sense people will come to understand and kind of be able to see those things that right now in our culture, like you said, hierarchy and authority in the church and magisterium, all those terms kind of turn people off. But once you explain to them the philosophical reasoning behind those principles in the church, in that large, just coherent message that the church has for us, then I think it's a really great resource and tool for people to be able to use that philosophy and figure out really good ways to interact with others in our culture, to present our theology to them in ways that is more convincing.
Yeah, I say amen, brother. Yeah, David, I see you there, man. You want to hop in on the conversation at all?
Buddy. Yes. Well, thank you. I have a lot of upper level academic questions, because you're definitely an authority. So I'd like to find out a lot from you about stuff that I don't really know. And I would start with the landscape, the topography of the debate right now in the academic world.
Sure.
Like, basic level, what's your sense and assessment of where the debate is who's winning? What are the big arguments right now that are succeeding against us?
Yeah,
Great
well,
question.
let's frame it or restrict it a little bit when we say the debate. At least the debate that I'm in, more of a, I guess, a conversation within philosophy of religion, or worldview competitors, right? And the ones that get the most attention, and the ones that I focus in on my book, would be something like classical theism and metaphysical naturalism. But those don't exhaust the logical space. There's other worldviews out there, right? Like animism and not forms of non-classical theism and stuff like that. But to me, classical theism and naturalism seem to be the primary competitors. So for the sake of argument, I do restrict my book to looking at those two sort of theories, right? And even within naturalism, you have different expressions and articulations. You have your naturalists that are sort of, again, the more staunch reductivists, materialists, physicalists, and then you have more liberal naturalists that would be more willing to allow kind of more spooky things into their ontology and stuff like that. So it's just important to note that there's a lot going on here, and you don't want to oversimplify it or give the a wrong or false impression. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you detect any difference between the academic world's atheism and the common high schooler, college students' atheism?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, of course.
Like,
and I would say the same thing about theists as well,
there?
right? Yeah. Oh, well, I mean, sophistication for sure. What you find among the academic atheists is often is a lot more charity and respect for theism, which many academic atheists think that theism is a very rational position to hold, and a lot of them are just sort of interested in not necessarily outright refuting theism, but showing why they are rational in holding to atheism or naturalism.
Right.
And that's obviously a very sort of different tone than your Richard Dawkins inspired high schooler, the God delusion type of nonsense or anything like that. So yeah, a lot of naturalists are just really interested in showing of why they think the naturalistic theory is, why they think it might be best, or why it's perfectly rational to hold, and they're might be perfectly still willing to concede that theism itself is a very rational position. So you have conversations like that, a lot more, and that's sort of the nature of academic conversation. You do philosophy for a while, you get your ass kicked enough, you learn to have a little bit more modesty and humility no matter what side you're on. So you just sort of find that across the board. You also find that theists tend to sometimes are a lot punchier. You have a lot of theists, even including on the Protestant side, that try to show that atheism is not rational to hold, right? And of course, there's counter punches to that from atheists as well. But you can think of whether you think their arguments are successful or not. You think of people like Alvin Plantinga, who gives his arguments from reason, his evolutionary arguments against naturalism, to try to show that even if naturalism is true, we couldn't know that it's true, so it's not really a the most rational position to hold. So there's so much there, right? I mean, this is there's just so many different thinkers. It's hard for me to, because I'll say something like that, but I'll think of somebody who's the exception to that. You know what I mean? But overall, the conversation, of course, in the professional levels is far more respectful, far more serious, far more interesting. That's for sure. But I think then how
about the young generation? My assessment is they're just not going for atheism anymore. They're just going straight for paganism.
That's or not? I mean, statistically, I think that's right. I mean, atheism it's always been a sort of minority position, and I think it always will be. It still is. And by atheism, I follow many sophisticated atheists here, including myself. Back when I was an atheist, it really is the commitment that there is no God or anything like God. It's not agnosticism. It's not saying I don't know if there's a God. It's not polytheism. It's just there is, the principles of nature are all you need, whatever those principles are. There's nothing supernatural. There's no ghosts or fairies or spirits or souls. That's what I take, atheism to be. And atheism, when it's interesting, is naturalism, right? Naturalism is just your philosophically developed form of atheism. You asked who's winning, man, that's hard to evaluate. I mean, I wrote a book that argue why I think classical theism wins, but that's just sure. That's just my statement. I would say this, and I will answer your other question. Sorry. Once something's open, I have to close it before I move on. It's
just sorry.
Annoying quirk of mine. I hate skipping things.
Sure.
I mean, there's been, I think, some really interesting developments and movements in different areas of philosophy of religion. Like, for example, the problem of evil, for a while, people were interested in advancing the logical problem of evil. You guys have probably you heard of these debates. And the logical problem of evil claims that negative states of affairs are in some sense strictly incompatible with the existence of God. Like, this is a solid disproof of God. But I think it is generally agreed upon that the logical problem of evil, there really are no successful formulations of it. I think of even, atheistic philosopher Graham Oppy. He doesn't think that there couldn't be a successful formulation of it, but he does admit that there is no current successful formulation of it. So that debate has certainly shifted, I think, in probably the theist's favor. And now we have these evidential or probabilistic, problems of evil, where there's different formulations of philosophers, atheists, or skeptics trying to show that negative states of affairs, broadly considered, are in some sense or some way evidence against the existence of God, even if not a absolute disproof. And how much evidence or how much weight is all part of that debate. So that's one particular area where I think that over the past several decades, the conversation really has evolved and developed in interesting and new ways. And I don't know, depending on one's assessment.
That's shocking to me. You really, nobody's seriously maintaining that the fact of evil in the world is a disproof of God.
No, there are. I mean, so there's a philosopher named James Sturba, and he's still pushing the logical problem of evil. But I would say
by and large,
the general, even many, very intelligent atheistic philosophers are willing to say, yeah, logical problem of evil, maybe we could get it to work, but nobody's really gotten it to work type of thing.
That's all I ever hear on Facebook. It's like, well, why did God make my life so horrible? Screw this, I'm gone.
Yeah. There's different problems of evil, right? There's an emotional and spiritual problem of evil, but as a philosopher, we're interested in what's the intellectual or philosophical problem of evil. Like, is there really something about negative states of affairs, and God is understood as classical theists, that these two things can't go together, right? It's like a square circle, right? Just cannot possibly be the case that God exists if these negative states of affairs
so we can point out to those people that if you just take a step back and abstract and be rational, you'll work through this one and come through to the belief.
Yeah, I mean, look, that might not be the most prudent thing to say to somebody who's really emotionally struggling with it. So you got to assess a person where, I mean, does a person need a philosopher, or do they need a pastor, or they need a friend, right? That's I don't know. That depends on the person you're chatting with. If they need a philosopher, then I think you should give them a philosophical answer. And I don't think I'm more aggressive. I not only don't think there is any successful formulation of the logical problem of evil, I don't think there in principle can be one. And I have my reasons why if we want to get into that later on. But and then I address the evidential or the probabilistic problems of evil in my book as well. And I have a very large section on that of why I actually think negative states of affairs, when properly situated and thoroughly analyzed, are actually better, more confirmatory of God's existence than atheistic naturalism. That's a very provocative thesis. I don't want to state it glibly, but I do my best to substantiate that in my book. But happy to chase down any of that as you guys want. So okay, there we go. I've said what I wanted to say. What else I'm sorry, you brought other things up.
Yeah, that was excellent.
Yeah.
So you studied this in college. Where did you study to start with?
So undergrad was Westchester University, and master's was Holy Apostles.
So master's was at a Catholic environment.
So I had very secular undergrad and very Catholic grad
way up
school,
there in Massachusetts.
Very different, very, very different experiences.
And that was before your atheist phase or after your atheist phase?
Oh man, I've got no. So once I was doing undergrad, still secular, but in the process, and then by the time I was doing my master's, I had converted. Right? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so when you were an undergrad, did you ever run into like several of the arguments in our favor just on the natural level? For instance, like okay, the last line in Aristotle's Physics is where Aristotle concludes that there is a first mover.
Yeah. Good luck if anybody's ever tried to read Aristotle's physics. So first off, I was never assigned Aristotle's physics until my master's program.
Okay.
So I was actually never. So my master's in philosophy, my undergrad is actually economics and finance. I did not undergrad in philosophy because the philosophy program was so awful. I did take as many philosophy classes as I could, but I mean, it really was just an indoctrination facility. And I don't just say that as a point of rhetoric or exaggeration. It was a truly awful, for my first, ethics professor, undergrad was a strong form moral relativist. And it was just an insane, and look, as a, somebody who went into undergrad as secular as you could get, even I couldn't stand how bad these programs were back then, as not completely, not even a religious person in any sense at that point. But did I get Aristotle's Physics as an undergrad, even in the philosophy courses I took? No, of course not.
Yeah, it was all modern philosophy from Descartes on, right?
More or less. Yeah, I mean, of course, you would get, a little bit here or there of Plato and Aristotle, but like certainly we weren't assigned. I wish we were assigned. I don't know if I was assigned to physics. Again, if anybody's ever tried to read the physics, that is hard.
Yeah.
Hard. Like read the Nicomachean. If you're going to start with Aristotle, read the Nicomachean Ethics.
Yeah.
Physics is something you need to be really patient with. And I'd recommend like you should do that, of course, under good tutelage. Otherwise, you're just not going to. If you try to go into the physics without any training, you're not going to get. You're just going to be deeply, deeply confused. That's just the nature of Aristotle's physics. Yeah.
Especially through the English language barrier from Greek.
Yeah.
So,
sorry, I didn't answer your question, but I guess the answer is no, right?
Yeah. I was creating the standard philosophy milieu nowadays in our public universities.
Yeah.
Right? So my dad, who's a physicist, used to always point out all of the Christian theists or theists in general are in the physics and hard sciences, whereas all the atheists are over there in the liberal arts side of the university.
Yeah, I haven't looked at the survey, data on this in a while, but my understanding is you do see certain. I forget what the percentages are. I don't want to butcher to get it wrong, but I think you will find more theists, physicists than you will biologists and stuff like that, right?
Right. Yeah.
Correctly, yeah. But biology isn't the the super soft stuff either, right?
Biology is like really just lab work nowadays. Because his reasoning was they know what they don't know. They see the extremes. So like physics, we have the fundamental constants argument, which I've only heard it from one place. Maybe you've heard it from more, where supposedly there's like 40 fundamental constants that formulate the structure of like our atoms and our fundamental particles. And if some of them one of them was just like slightly off, then the universe would instant collapse and not be able to hold its structure.
Yeah. So you're hinting at what's sometimes called the argument from fine tuning, or the fine tuning argument.
That one. Okay.
Yeah. To simplify it a bit for people, the idea is something like this: is that our universe seems to exhibit this phenomena of fine tuning, and this is agreed upon really has a very strong consensus among theists and atheists that the universe really does have this feature where certain things, fundamental constants of quantities, are just they're Goldilocks, right? They seem to be dialed in just right. That if things were just a teensy weensy bit different, like and we're talking like really teensy weensy bit, right? Mass of the electron, gravitational force of gravity, all that stuff. There's lots of them out there. People can look it up. There would have been catastrophic results when considering whether the emergence of interactive intelligent life could be a possibility, right? So again, that's generally agreed upon, that the universe does exhibit this sort of exquisite fine-tuning. Where the disagreement comes in is what explains it. Why? Right. What explains it? And then, of course, this is where theists will say, well, God has a very good explanation for this, right? And atheists, have a range of ways of trying to avoid that. They might say that it's just necessary, things had to be this way. I find that answer deeply unsatisfying. The more common proposal is the multiverse, which I'm sure everybody's heard about. That
Yeah,
our
what's
universe,
that?
yeah, that our universe is just sort of one universe and a collection of a great many, perhaps infinite number of universes. And there's this, universe generator or something like that. And, all these universes are just spit out, blah, 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 blah. And then eventually you're going to get one like us. And we're the lucky ones, right? So that's
it's
sort
like
of
this infinite series. But that, like, the way I was taught to respond to that at Christendom College was that, well, you have to make your per se series of causes arguments to show that they still haven't gotten back to a cause, to a first cause, I mean. The first mover cause.
I wouldn't want to confuse arguments here, right? So, yeah, one could say that you have a first cause argument for God, say Aquinas' De Ente or something like that. You work from contingency to necessity and necessity to divinity for people who are familiar with that path. Then, yeah, the multiverse doesn't affect that at all, right? Because there's nothing about the multiverse that would, sort of deflect any of the critical premises in a first cause argument. But that doesn't solve the objection to fine tuning, right? So we got to stay on course here, right? So yeah, what could you say to the multiverse objection to fine tuning? I think that I say a lot about it actually in my book. There's a whole chapter of this in my book. But generally, I think the thing to say here is that so far as we know, in terms of actual physical models, almost so they're useful in their predictions from the standpoint of what physicists are doing, there's nothing there that solves this problem that itself doesn't require fine tuning. So you have this relocation problem that you would need a finely tuned, multiverse or something like that to get the sort of predictions you want as from a physical theory. And so what you have here is just a sort of kicking the can down the road issue. You haven't really solved the problem. You've just sort of delayed the problem, if you will. I think that's actually a pretty good response. And there's other responses you can give as well. And if people want to go a little bit deeper into this, I have a lot more in my book as well. But I also had a conversation with physicist Luke Barnes, who's sort of considered, one of the foremost experts on this particular debate. If people want to check that out, that was on my Philosophy for the People channel probably about a year ago. They can search that one up.
Yeah, so are you much in the field of psychological proofs for God's existence? And I don't mean modern psychology, I mean classical psychology, based in human nature. Things like Augustine's trinities in people, the spirit, soul, and body, or intellect, will, and memory, or our heart being restless until it rests in God.
Those arguments have always intrigued me. They're not arguments that I've specialized in or developed so much myself. I do have a whole section in my book on philosophy of mind that argues for an immaterial aspect about us, and there I actually develop a really fascinating argument from a thinker I admire very much. He was at the University of Pennsylvania. His name is James Ross. This is his book, Thought and World. And it really is, I think, a modern development of, the sort of line of thought you see in Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas for the immaterial aspect of the human person as it relates to, of course, the human intellect. But that's different than the types of arguments that you're talking about. So yeah, I guess the answer is no. Those arguments. There's a lot of arguments that fascinate me. I don't really have a very strong assessment or opinion on them, mostly because that's it. They've just fascinated me, but I haven't had the time or the sort of, I guess, enough interest to really kind of pursue them.
That's fine. So do you buy what I was taught at Christendom College, that there are two kinds of arguments for God's existence? I'm sorry if I have to ask this, since this must be rudimentary too, but that there are existential, based on per se series of causes arguments, and then there's Boethius's essential argument, which is also Aquinas's way number 4, that there's just qualities in the world that reflect similar qualities in God. And most people agree that the existential ones work and the essential ones don't really work, as last I heard.
Yeah, well, that's it's an interesting question. So when you talk about Aquinas' first cause arguments, I mean, man, I don't even know if I would carve the landscape up like that. Yeah, how would I carve? So Aquinas' arguments are unique, at least if you're talking about his first, second, and third way. Fourth way, the genealogical argument is different, as you said, and fifth way is the argument from teleology, right? So you mentioned, a per se series of causes, or an essentially ordered series of causes, and what Aquinas is up to there is he's showing that there's a sort of grounding structure to reality, where you have this sort of deep metaphysical dependency of certain things upon other things, namely God, the first cause. Where if God weren't the sort of first immediate productive cause of these things, they wouldn't exist at all, period, for an instant, right? It's not that we need to trace back in time to some first deity that sort of flicked the first domino. We have a sort of hierarchical series of sustaining grounding causes, if you will. Without that fundamental first principle whose essence is existence, we wouldn't have anything whose essence is really distinct from existence at all. So, right, the idea of a per se series of causes is that it's wholly irrelevant whether the universe had a temporal beginning or not. He's avoiding that entire debate. He's like, even if the universe is past eternal, given the sort of the structure of reality, this grounding structure of reality, there has to be that fundamental first principle that is purely actual, whose essence is existence, or else, the entire system of nature, the finite, contingent, qualitatively restricted things, they wouldn't be here at all for an instant. That's what Aquinas is up to, right? I think those are very powerful arguments. There are other sorts of first cause arguments, however, they're different from that are concerned with different with causal regresses that are not per se. And we can think of like the Kalam cosmological argument that is interested in whether the universe actually had an absolute beginning, whether there was a beginning to space and time. It's got a lot of contemporary defenders. Dr. William Lane Craig, a Protestant philosopher, is a big proponent of this argument, but you have Catholics that have advanced certain theses that support this argument, like causal finitism. I'm thinking of thinkers like Dr. Robert Koons and Dr. Alexander Pruss. So they seem to be proponents or at least supportive of this type of argument. I don't go in for it heavily. My mind is sort of not made up on that argument. I find Aquinas's arguments quite decisive, and they avoid the whole eternal universe debate entirely. I think they're just stronger arguments. I think that debate's fascinating.
But that's an example of a non-per se existential argument, you said.
That would be a first cause argument that is, I think, different than Aquinas's, but often people confuse Aquinas's argument for that type of argument, right? So that's why I want to bring that up. But there's also ways of arguing for God that are more contemporary, and I do this in my book. I kind of combine methodologies that are really just about worldview comparison. So it's not about giving a sort of valid deductive syllogism to a metaphysical proof for God, but it's really about theory comparison. And the idea is, look, we have all this these large scale features of reality. This is the data that we need a philosophical theory to explain, contingency, consciousness, the moral dimension, physical fine tuning, right? All right, here's classical theism and here's metaphysical naturalism or whatever other theory. Let's see what theory can make the most sense of this data with the fewest, fundamental commitments. What is the simplest theory that explains the most?
Occam's razor in reverse.
In a sense, there's Occam's razor at play, and we can talk. I have a whole section in my book of why simplicity is an important criteria for theory selection. I kind of get into the philosophy behind that, and argue why I think classical theism is actually the theory that explains the most with the least. So that isn't a straight proof of God, but it's another type of argument for the existence of God that wouldn't fall, I think, into either of the two categories that you just listed out. And I think it's actually I think it's a very productive approach. And you have to explain how you get your predictions from your philosophical theories, but in a sense, this is sort of scientific, right? Scientists like their theories. They see what does a theory predict? Do those predictions land? Are there any predictions that don't land? Is my theory disconfirmed? Like, philosophers are kind of doing a lot of that same stuff, just in a different way, right? What would I expect if my theory of classical theism is true? What sort of world would I anticipate? Why do I have these anticipations? You got to justify that. And then how do those predictions land when I compare it to the predictions of, metaphysical naturalism and stuff like that. So that's what a lot of my book does, actually, is that approach to God. And so that would be just a whole different category of argumentation, more contemporary, more modern, but I think it can be very fruitfully engaged. So I would just divide the territory up, I guess, a bit differently. Then you have, your sort of family of ontological arguments, and then you were talking about, Boethius. By the way, I think if people want like a really good text just to get into like a classic philosophy, you got to start with Consolation of Philosophy.
Yeah, that's the essential argument, right? Basically, in way number 4, Boethius's.
Now, I also just want to, let it be known that when we talk about Aquinas' 5 ways,
yes,
and Thomism, it's really Thomisms. There's lots of different schools of Thomism, and there's lots of different thinkers who have different interpretations of Aquinas' 5 ways. I fall into what might be called the camp of existential Thomists, and really what I would contend is you should look at all the 5 ways through the lens of Aquinas' De Ante et Essentia, which is, the treatise he wrote in, I think,
early
late 20s or something like that, right? Where he develops his argument for the real distinction between essence and existence, and that should set your philosophical backdrop to interpret and unify the 5 ways. There's other Thomists who have different, interpretations of those. So, like, there's, debates within debates type of thing like that. Things are a lot more complicated than they initially may seem. So yeah, sorry, I went off.
No, that's a great answer.
There, yeah.
So you're basically focusing more on like extrapolated regression demonstrations of God rather than like deductive proofs.
So I do both. The first section of my book is giving a sort of contemporary version of a traditional cosmological argument, where he takes some, presumably undeniable fact of reality or experience, and then argue that this fact of reality has a necessary condition, and that necessary condition, through a lot of philosophical argumentation and analysis, is God, right?
Right.
No God, no world is like the cartoon version of it. World, therefore God, right? Please don't take that summary too seriously. There's a lot more detail to that sort of argument in my book, right? So I start my book off with that type of traditional, but with contemporary updating cosmological argument that moves from effect to first cause. And I think it's dispositive, but I understand that not everybody is, always convinced by just a single argument. But I try to land some points on the board, and I use that argument also to articulate the God hypothesis, if you will. What classical theism is, right? What the commitments of classical theism are. And then I say, okay, this argument gave us this theory of reality. And it's pretty well crafted. That argument kind of told us not only that God exists, but a lot of qualities or features of God. Absolutely simple, purely actual, essence is its existence, omnipotent, omniscient, so on and so forth. Perfectly good once you have the theory of the transcendentals and all that, right? Okay, now let's take this theory, and now let's compare it to other theories to see how well it does when explaining all the other features of reality, to see if we can pick up some additional confirmation or sort of usher in a more cumulative case. Because again, going back to Levi's, question of how do you engage with people? Well, different people are different. They're going to respond to different things. So, if I don't have to put all my eggs in one basket, why would I do that? Because even for myself, the more arguments, the merrier. I'm not just trying to like randomly shotgun blast people. I think that's cheap. Every argument I put in the book, I think, is a forceful argument, of course, right? And I leave out the arguments that I think suck. But I do think a very powerful cumulative case can be made, and that you can combine these different philosophical approaches to God, your traditional first cause argument that I give my version of my formulation of, with the sort of more modern worldview comparison approach. I think they can be married together, and it's a more powerful case can be made when you do that, right?
Yeah, and it's more accessible to common humanity.
I think so, yeah, but I don't know. Sure. People have to read the book and tell me what they think. Yeah.
So so that's basically the heart and soul of all my questions. So I'd be happy to turn it back over to to you, Mr. Pingleton.
Questions, David, and I'm so glad you were here with me to ask those, man, because you really drew out a lot of stuff that I think is very important for our audience to get to know about Pat, and also some excellent resources for people to begin to have a link to jump right into looking into, the deeper philosophical truths of Catholicism, and as well as how to engage people in those kind of arguments. And Pat, your book, man, it just sounds incredible. I haven't had a chance to actually read it yet, but I'm definitely going to after our conversation here. And I was just noticing as I was kind of just doing more research on you yesterday, you have an excellent little section in on your YouTube channel where you go into Leibniz and his contingency arguments that he has. How influential is Leibniz tradition on your own personal views?
Yeah, it's quite influential. So you have sort of the Leibnizian tradition of the cosmological argument in comparison to the Thomistic tradition, and the differences at first might be a bit hard to detect, but I think they're actually pretty significant. So what Leibniz is up to is he's pretty committed to what's called the principle of sufficient reason, and this is the idea that everything that exists has an adequate explanation for its existence and the attributes that it has. And he thinks that the entire sort of aggregate of contingent facts, right, which is that if you just take all the things that are contingent, the things that do exist, but there's nothing about their nature or essence that guarantees their existence, you can kind of smush those things together and form this big clump of contingent facts. And he thinks that the principle of sufficient reason applies to that big clump, right? And the only way you're going to get an adequate explanation of why there are any contingent things at all is there has to be at least one necessary thing, right? Some being that exists with a sort of the most robust, sort of sturdy existence, self-sufficient existence possible, and that, of course, Leibniz thinks is God, the being whose essence is his existence. And so, he's very committed to his version of the principle of sufficient reason. I defend a version of the principle of sufficient reason in my book. I think that it's sort of a bedrock principle of reason and rationality, and that it is a metaphysically necessary true principle, and that it can be used to fuel a cosmological argument. I also think you can run a cosmological argument without the principle of sufficient reason, and I think that Aquinas's paths, multiple, can show us how to do that. And I tease that path in my book, but I have another article that develops that a bit more substantially. But Aquinas he's not worried about aggregating things together, of looking for an explanation of all the contingent things plural. Aquinas is actually going to say you just take any one thing whose essence is really distinct from its existence, and you can show that the necessary condition for even just any one thing like that would be a being whose essence just is his existence, which is God. Another path that Aquinas takes is you can consider if there were something hypothetically whose essence, by the way, essence is just the whatness of something, right? Where its existence is the isness of something. Sorry, I should have mentioned that earlier. If you consider, if there was something whose essence is existence, what would it be like? And Aquinas wants to tell you that it would be uniquely unique, right? If there was such a thing, there could only be one of them. It's not susceptible to multiplication. Why? Because this thing would have a nature that is both simple and self-sufficient, right? It's simple and self-sufficient. Its essence just is its existence, and if you had, multiple instances of it, it would violate its nature as simple and self-sufficient. You would need some sort of differentiating factor, and then you would have, an ontologically complex entity, so it wouldn't be this simple self-sufficient thing anymore, right? That's Aquinas' argument in a nutshell. So if there were one of these things, it would be uniquely unique. There could be one and only one of them. It's non-multipliable. To multiply it would mean having to contradict its nature. Right, it's a little bit technical, but I actually think it's quite brilliant.
Parmenides, that's the Parmenidean one that they start us off at Christendom College with.
So yeah, we can circle back to that too in a minute, but to close this loop, what Aquinas will say, well, look, there's multiples of all these things out there. There's multiple rabbits and electrons. He didn't know about electrons, but whatever, and people, this or that. So since there's these multiples out there, these clearly are not things whose essence just is this existence. So they must be things with a real distinction between their essence and existence. And this is a great theory because it helps to explain their contingency, why their nature, why they can come into existence and pass out of existence. There's nothing about their nature or their essence that guarantees that they exist, right? So this is a really nice theory, right? It's a nice theory because the real distinction between essence and existence helps to make sense of contingency. But now guess what? Now we need a necessary condition for the existence of all these things whose essence is not their existence, so that that thing we considered as a hypothetical before is not just a hypothetical. It's an actual reality. There has to be that thing whose essence is existence, right, to sort of underwrite the existence of all these contingent finite things. So again, a lot of more detail that goes into each of these arguments. So hopefully I've said enough to show that they are distinct styles or ways of arguing for the first cause, Leibnizian and Thomistic. So they have a family resemblance, but they are unique. They are unique, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Wow. Great, and that leads me up into another question for you as far as basically what is your main goal as far as for your own evangelical purposes of your YouTube channel and sharing your philosophical views, and ultimately what is your goal in all of it? What would you like your work to produce?
Well, thanks, Leo. That's a good question. I mean, my original goal was always very selfish. I just wanted to know what the heck was going on. right? Always had these philosophical questions since I was a kid, and I think I was, we all have to, check our biases and emotional prejudices and this and that. But I really think, looking back, I really just sort of wanted to know what reality was about, right? I wanted good answers to the big, hard questions. So philosophy has always been super self-serving to me. And over time, I guess people kind of found the questions that I was asking interesting as well. Of course they do. They're just fundamental questions that all of us ask, usually as children, until our parents get annoyed and tell us to cut it off, or teachers get annoyed and tell us to stop asking these things, right? It's one of my favorite ways to describe philosophy, actually. Mortimer Adler said this. Philosophy is just going back to all those great questions you had as a kid and realizing that you are allowed to ask them, and now it's time to take them seriously as an adult. Dang, that's good, isn't it? That's good.
Oh yeah.
So right, and then once I converted, and people told me that they found my story interesting or helpful, and the work that I'm doing interesting or helpful. I've again taken a page from Mortimer Adler, a brilliant philosopher who's got an incredible conversion story of his own. I think he became Catholic in his mid to late 90s. The dude just squeezed in right at the end there, right? Brilliant man, but he was great because he was a guy who was dedicated to making difficult thought easy. He could write works of philosophy that were simple but not diluted, distilled but not distorted, if you will. And that was always a great inspiration to me because it showed a real mastery of the material. And there's a lot of that sort of lacking in that sort of that middle space, right? There's a lot of popular level stuff, and okay, it's easy to read, but frankly, it's not very good. There's a lot of academic stuff. A lot of it's very good, but it's not very easy to read. So I felt that there was opportunity there. Well, maybe I could work hard and try and take a lot of the stuff that I think is happening at the academic level that is really good, and even just for a challenge myself, see if I could get it down well enough that I could communicate it to people who are interested in this stuff that maybe don't have the formal training or background in philosophy, and just try and make difficult thought easy. And I love sharing philosophical ideas. It's my passion, right? I love it, as much as a lot of other, I want to say more than anything, but it's up there. And to the extent that it helps people, with their faith or belief in God and stuff like that, that's awesome. I'm just happy to hear that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I've helped this guy a whole lot, and just really a whole lot of my philosophical learning has either come from your channel or has come from just watching and reading from Peter Kreeft and a few other favorites of mine. But I just really started looking into philosophy about a year ago, and fortunately ended up running into David here, he's written a scholastic philosophy textbook on his own. And he's, like you said, brought it into a simplified language to where it's easy for me to be taught and learn. And I've noticed from your channel as well that you've kind of taken that philosophical element that I feel like is really lacking in catechesis and also in just our culture in general. So many people just are not well informed about philosophy at all, and it's very important that they are. And I really think it's extremely fundamentally important for the Catholic laity and any laity, period, in any community of believers. But especially in our church, that they learn these philosophical principles that are the underlying fundamentals to the very doctrine and teaching that they're learning from, the church and through the catechism. And you can't read a document from our church in the last 2,000 years that doesn't have some sort of underlying philosophical principles that you really need to understand, and that can be taught in simple ways that you've shown us how to do on your YouTube channel.
Yeah, I mean, look, we're thinking beings, right? And philosophy is really, well, I like how Alvin Plantinga put it. Philosophy is just thinking hard about things, and it's best done slow. So philosophy is well, it has many branches. It's got logic, which is the study of the structure of thought. It's got metaphysics, the study of being as such. It's got ethics, the study of the good life. Philosophical anthropology, the study of the human person. What is the nature of the human person? And people stand, I think, to be enormously enriched by at least a basic, philosophical education, some basic philosophical training, right? Help you to think in clear and consistent channels. Who wouldn't benefit from that? And I'm with you that this has been woefully neglected in our modern age. But thankfully, we've got a very small YouTube channel out there, mine, and we'll do what we can. Kidding, of course, but yeah.
We can add a unique aspect to the dimensions that you've already kind of laid some foundational work for us, because I'd be lying if you weren't a high inspiration for me to even get out there and start doing things like this. And man, I'm in awe getting to talk to you and learn from somebody who I've gained so much out of already. So it's just incredible.
Well, thank you guys. It's very, very, very flattering, and I feel definitely undeserved, but I appreciate it, and I appreciate you guys and everything you're doing and having me on your channel today.
Well, you answered a lot of the questions that I had been itching to ask someone for many, many years. So thank you very much. It's eye-opening to see someone who's actually like on the cusp of this particular issue, which is like central to our making a case for ourselves as a church, even for our constructing our natural worldviews and things like that.
Yeah, well, thank you, David. They were really good questions, and you brought up when you brought up Aquinas's arguments, focusing on essentially ordered causal series.
Sure.
Send me a note. I'll send you an article I had that was published in the December issue of the Review of Metaphysics, where I relate that to discussions in contemporary grounding, and I develop an argument to show that these types of causal series, they're either necessarily terminating or they're non-explanatory. So I'm trying to situate a lot of Aquinas's insights in certain contemporary discussions surrounding theories of grounding and causation. You might be interested in that.
Yes, I would. Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, and I know we're not into a whole lot in this interview, and I'm probably running out of time, Pat. But I'm wanting to jump into and just get some of your ideas and your views on the current crisis in the church and different just spiritual aspects. But would you be willing to come and meet with us again sometime soon to maybe talk about more cultural views and
yeah, I don't know. I have a whole lot to offer on that. You probably find some people who are more up to date on those. I know, I'm aware of them, obviously, and I have some thoughts, but that's the thing about being in love with philosophy and having a pretty heavy dose of OCD, is I tend to be hyper focused on just particular issues that are of interest to me at the moment. But whatever, man, I'm happy to jam on whatever you guys want anytime. Yeah.
Dude, well, I'd love to invite you on again and have you on and talk about some more stuff, but obviously we'll talk some more philosophy as well. But I really greatly appreciate you coming on, and I'm unfortunately running out of time myself, so I'm going to wrap it up. David, do you have any final thoughts or questions for Pat before we round it up here?
The quote that they teach us at Christendom College right at the start is, as Socrates said, the unexamined life is not worth living. So let's keep asking the big questions and pricking people's consciences so that they think to ask the big questions too, at least at some stage in their life when they think back to about us. Philosophy is what we're about here, you know. So anyway, that's all for now.
Cool. Well, Pat, thank you very much, man, for coming on and spending so much time with us. And dude, your answers to David's questions, especially, and to mine, man, you really gave us a whole lot to chew on here. So we really appreciate you, man, and look forward to getting to talk to you again very soon.
Yeah, thank you guys. God bless.